Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today, this is a super special episode to us. The three of us have been eagerly awaiting this conversation with Dr. Sheldon Solomon. Welcome, Sheldon.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So, for our listeners who have been following us for a while, you have heard us reference terror management theory many, many times in episodes. So today we're going to actually tell you what that's all about by one of the creators, researchers in the field. So Sheldon, I'm just going to read your bio because that's what we do. And then we're going to jump right into some conversation. Sheldon Solomon is professor of psychology at Skidmore College. His studies of the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on attitudes and behavior have been supported by the National Science Foundation and Ernest Becker Foundation and featured in the documentary film Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. He is co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and The Warmer at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. Sheldon is an American Psychological Society Fellow, a recipient of the American Psychological Association Presidential Citation, a Lifetime Career Award by the International Society for Self and Identity, the Association of Graduate Liberal Studies Programs Annual Faculty Award, and a Career Contribution Award by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll tell you, it's funny. I've been waiting for this conversation for about 30 years because I remember originally seeing you lecture at the International Congress on Death and Dying in Montreal. And you gave a keynote address, and I said it was like being at the top of a mountain and being pushed on your skis. I said it was like a ramshackled sleigh. I just held on for dear life listening to it, going, oh my God, I think I'm following this, and getting to the bottom of the hill going, wow, just wow. I went out and I bought the tape,
Wow.
and then Julie reminded me last night, the first Christmas we worked together at Fleming College, it was Christmas Eve and there wasn't a whole lot going on. And I said, Julie, you got to listen to this. And we probably listened to it every Christmas Eve for about 2 or 3 years.
On December 24th, Sheldon, if you can imagine, these two little college counselors, one of the ways we thought it was good to spend the morning of the 24th is we would listen to you speaking about terror management theory.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, I can't stand looking at myself or listening to myself, Red, but I remember the Montreal experience very vividly, in part because that was the first constituency that took our ideas rather seriously. At that time, academic psychologists were just dismissing us as either wrong or irrelevant, and it was the people who were in clinical settings who recognized the potential importance of our enterprise. It was Balfour Mount at McGill University who invited me to the conference, and without their encouragement and support, I would be in my original vocation. I'm just a dishwasher who read a few books.
Well, I can tell you, it was one of those, for me, one of those career moments where it was just like light bulbs went off, but it was just like a whole trainer or whole area of thought just expanded.
Mm-hmm. Of course, now we don't have, Red doesn't have the technology to play that tape anymore.
That's good point.
I do. And it's on my shelf with my books at work. And I make people listen to it, whoever I think might need to hear it. But anyway, thank you, Sheldon, for coming here. And so we thought that maybe we would start by trying to give a good foundation of what terror management theory is for folks who haven't been exposed to it before. And so we thought we'd just maybe start by saying, how did you come to this place? What was your journey to this field? And then a little bit of the major foundation and tenets of what the theory is.
Yeah, no, thank you. And first of all, it's delightful to be here, and I was looking forward to this for quite some time also. My journey here is both personal and professional. On the personal front, I've been radically disinclined to die since the day that I realized it was inevitable when I was 8 years old, and that was the day that my grandmother died. And the day before, my mom said, say goodbye to Grandma. She's very sick. And we knew that things were bad, but she died the next day, and everyone was sad, and I was in my bedroom, and I collected stamps when I was a kid. And I'm sitting there looking at my stamp collection, and I'm noticing, there's George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And I'm like, wow, everybody on those stamps is dead. And then I was like thinking about it. And I was like, and what does that mean? And I was like, that means my mom someday is going to get old and be dead. And that was a jolt. I'm like, where's the spaghetti and chocolate pudding going to come from? But that was only a minor perturbation, because it didn't take much longer before I extended the temporal dimension a bit and realized that at some vaguely unspecified moment, I too would be obliterated. And that was my first existential crisis. I remember quite vividly being rather mortified by that prospect, and somehow managed to bury it under the psychological bushes for a couple of decades. Then I got out of graduate school. I had a PhD in experimental social psychology, and my training was in biomedical research. It's in a completely different field than what we ended up doing. Anyway, I got to Skidmore College. It was my first week as a professor there. I was supposed to teach a course about personality, and I was in the library looking for books by Freud. And I saw two books right next to each other by a guy I had never heard of, a cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker. One was called The Birth and Death of Meaning, and the other was called The Denial of Death. And I opened The Birth and Death of Meaning, and in the first paragraph, Becker said, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I remember saying, yeah, me too, finally. Somebody, not another non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia in the form of a jargon-laden textbook. Here's a guy saying, I want to figure out why we are the way that we are in the service of enhancing personal growth and fostering social progress. I'm like, count me in. I'm a former hippie. And then in the next book, The Denial of Death, he just said that it is the defining characteristic of humanity that we are uniquely aware of the inevitability of death, and our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition is the fundamental motivational impetus for almost everything that we do, whether we're aware of it or not. And if you'll pardon the expression, I saw that and I was like, fuck, that at the very least is explaining myself to me. That made me realize that my experience as an 8-year-old, being totally mortified and mystified by that realization that I might not be the only one on the planet that might feel that way. Well, anyway, in a proverbial nutshell, what Becker said is, look, if we want to understand why people are the way they are, we need to ask two questions at the same time. How are we the same as all living things, and how are we different than all living things? And he's like, following Darwin, we're the same as all living things because we're biologically constructed to want to stay alive. On the other hand, we're uniquely different by virtue of our big brain. Without being overly arrogant, it does give us the capacity to think abstractly and symbolically to the point where only humans can imagine something that doesn't yet exist and then have the audacity to make it real. That's magnificent, and let's not forget that. But then Becker goes to Kierkegaard, And he says, Kierkegaard pointed out that we're so smart that we actually realize that we're here. And that's different. The rose bush is here but doesn't know it. A raccoon's here but doesn't know it. But we're here and we know it. And that is both awesome as well as dreadful, right? If we have another couple of hours someday, we'll switch over to the awe side, because it is important to realize that at our best, we are sublimely appreciative of the spontaneous exuberance that is engendered by the mere fact that we are both alive and aware of that. I like that, yes. On the other hand, Kierkegaard points out that lest ye be either a child or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to know that, like all living things, you know that you're a finite duration, and someday too will die. And not only will you die someday, but you can die at any moment for things that you can't anticipate or control. And then, just to knee us in the psychological groin, Becker adds that we just can't stand that we're animals, breathing pieces of defecating meat, no more significant or enduring than ferrets or figs. And what he argued is that if that's the only thing that you thought about, I'm going to die someday and can walk outside and be hit by a meteor, that you wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We would just literally be, pulsating pieces of biological protoplasm, cowering under our beds, groping for large sedatives. And so that raises the question of how is it that we're able to even stand up in the morning? And Becker, his one-word answer as an anthropologist was culture. But he said that quite ingeniously and quite unconsciously, that human beings managed the existential terror engendered by the awareness of our mortality by embracing cultural worldviews, humanly constructed visions of reality that we share with the people in our group, that enable us to manage death anxiety by giving us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And then he goes on and he says, well, what do I mean by meaning? He's like, look, every culture has an account of the origin of the universe. Every culture has a prescription for how we're supposed to behave while we're here. Every culture has some hope of immortality, be it literal or symbolic. And his fundamental point, I call this common sense masquerading as psychological insight, is that in order to get up in the morning, that you need to feel that life has meaning. I've never heard anybody say, let's celebrate the fact that everything means nothing. All right, so for Becker, meaning is necessary but not sufficient. What we need in addition is a sense that we as individuals are significant contributors to the cosmological drama to which we subscribe. And for Becker, this is Sociology 101. What culture does is to give us each social roles. If I'm a nurse, I'm supposed to save lives. If I'm a goalie on the hockey team, I'm supposed to keep the puck from going into the net, and so on and so forth. And if we live up to the standards associated with our particular social roles, then we are, in Becker's words, creatures of value in a world of meaning, and he calls that self-esteem. And in a proverbial nutshell, that's Becker's enterprise. He says, in order to manage existential dread engendered by the awareness of death, we embrace cultural conceptions of reality that give us a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. Therefore, whether we know it or not, our lives are fundamentally devoted to maintaining our culturally constructed vision of reality and our sense of worth in the context of that reality. And moreover, if our reality is or our self-esteem is threatened, we will automatically engage in a variety of defensive responses to restore confidence in our worldview and in ourselves as individuals. And so that's Becker in a nutshell. Red's question was about terror management theory. And very quickly, so we read these books. And in the 1980s, I was like, this is radically important. We want to tell other people about these ideas. So we went to all these conferences, and psychologists would listen for about a minute before they would run out. And my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, who I work with developing terror management theory, they would be like, well, I don't think they like these ideas. I'd be like, they love it. They're just running out to get the paper that we've not yet written. But then we wrote a paper, and it was just describing Becker's ideas, just like I did. And we sent it to the American Psychologist, where it was rejected with a single sentence review. I have no doubt that these ideas are of no interest whatsoever to any psychologist, alive or dead. And Jeff and Tom said, oh, they don't like it. I'm like, no, they're being coy. They want it. No, but they didn't. The paper was then rejected by every journal on earth, including Parade Magazine and Better Homes and Garden. And that's when we're like, it was actually talking to an editor of the American Psychologist who just said, look, these ideas may be interesting, but no academic psychologist will take them seriously in the absence of empirical evidence. Mm-hmm. And so we developed terror management theory, which is basically taking all of Becker's ideas and reducing them to a few conceptual assertions that allowed us to then generate hypotheses that could be subjected to empirical scrutiny. At English translation, we've spent the last 40 years, first by ourselves, then with our students, now with colleagues all over the world, developing empirical proof that we believe provides lots of support for Becker's central claim about the fundamental role of death in life. So I hope that makes sense for folks that are not previously familiar with these ideas.
It sure does. At least it does to me.
I loved being back on that sleigh, just careening down the hill. So you got to a point where it was like, in order for us to get credibility, we need to be able to start to show this theory operating in real life.
That's right. Look, like all folks, we yearned for some credibility, and that would be good. But like Becker, we tried to not be overly egotistical. Becker's point was, I don't want people idolizing me. I want them recognizing the poignancy of these ideas and to attend to them directly. Yeah, that was what we were trying to do, Red. We used to end every one of our talks by saying, if we're successful, you'll be going and reading Becker's books for yourself.
Right.
And what we realized, at least in the 1980s, in North American and European academic psychology, was that in order to disseminate these ideas more broadly within and between disciplines, we were going to have to provide proof in that sense of the word. I don't want to argue that there's only one gateway to the truth, but we were trained as egghead experimental psychologists. And so this put us in a good position to use our skills in order to help bridge Becker's ideas with these other constituencies.
What was the result?
The result is not for us to judge, but I can at least tell you in principle what we did. And that, so good question. So what we said was, okay, how are we going to show that Becker was on the right track? And we developed three different paradigms. One of them was just to establish that self-esteem buffers anxiety. So we did a series of experiments where we manipulated self-esteem. We either left it alone or we elevated it momentarily by giving people positive feedback on a personality test or an IQ test. And then we exposed them to threatening stimuli in order to determine if elevated self-esteem buffers anxiety. And so, for example, in one study, people whose self-esteem was elevated and then watched movies of an autopsy and an electrocution, they reported being less anxious if their self-esteem had been elevated just before. Right, that's interesting, but, watching a movie about an electrocution is not the same as being threatened yourself. So we did another set of more convincing studies where we hooked people up to a physiograph machine and told them that they were going to receive some painful electrical shocks, either after raising their self-esteem or leaving it alone. And sure enough, when self-esteem was elevated, people were less physiologically aroused in anticipation of a physical harm. And so that's one set of work. Self-esteem does indeed buffer anxiety in general and about death in particular. And then another set of studies is based on what we call the mortality salience hypothesis. And the argument there is, well, how do we show that our beliefs about reality have anything to do with death? And we came up with what is, in retrospect, a very simple idea. We were like, well, let's remind some people that they're going to die. Let's ask other people to think about something aversive but not fatal. And if our beliefs have to do with death denial, then when death is on our mind, we should cling more tenaciously to them. And that should in turn make us support more vigorously our cultural worldview and efforts to maintain self-esteem. And so, for example, in some of our experiments, we just ask people, they're filling out a bunch of personality assessments. And then right in the middle of it, we just have two open-ended questions saying, hey, write down your thoughts and feelings about your own death. And what do you think is going to be happening as you're physically dying? And again, in control conditions, we're like, think about the same thing. You have a tooth taken out and there's no anesthesia. You're in a car accident and had to chop a leg off. You failed an exam, you got fired from your job, all unpleasant, but not fatal. And so that's one way that we make death salient. Other times we go outside and we stop some people in front of a funeral parlor and other people 100 meters to either side. And our thought is that if you're talking in front of a funeral parlor, death may be on your mind, even if you don't know it. And then other times back in the lab, we have people read stuff on a computer and we flash the word death so fast that you don't even know that you've seen anything. There's now literally thousands of studies that show that momentary reminders of our own mortality have significant and predictable effects on our attitudes and behavior. And so the first thing that we were interested in is how come people can't get along with folks who are different? Why have we, since the dawn of human history, been perpetrating genocidal atrocities on people who don't share our beliefs about reality? And Becker's idea is very simple, and that is that if my beliefs protect me from death anxiety, if I accept the veracity of other beliefs, I'm undermining the confidence with which I subscribe to my own. And therefore, according to Becker, when I run into people who are different, I disparage and dehumanize them. I try to get them to dispose of their ideas and accept mine instead. Or if that doesn't work, just kill them, thus proving that my God and my ideas are superior after all. All right, so sure enough, when we remind people that they're going to die, the Christians like Christians a lot more, and they hate Jewish people. When Germans are reminded that they're going to die, they sit closer to fellow Germans and further away from people that are Turkish. Iranians reminded of death are more eager to become suicide bombers, and so on and so forth. And so that's one line of inquiry. based on what we call the mortality salience paradigm. And we can talk much more about other domains in which that particular paradigm has been deployed to understand other aspects of human behavior. But one other paradigm real quick, and that's what we call the death thought accessibility paradigm. And that's basically turning the mortality salience thing around. So if you ask people to think about death, they cling more tenaciously to their culture. But if you threaten their beliefs or self-esteem, that brings non-conscious thoughts of death more readily to mind. Right? And so if you show Christian fundamentalists logical inconsistencies in the Bible, death thought accessibility increases. Canadians who are shown fake articles by Australians mocking them for their fondness for beer and hockey, that makes death thought accessibility come more readily to mind. Thinking about aspects of ourselves that we're not particularly fond of, that makes death thought accessibility come more readily to mind. All right, so let me stop there, and then you tell me how we want to move on. But those are basically the different research paradigms, because what we then did was to apply them to every area of inquiry, because Becker said, look, when death is on your mind, it influences everything from who you vote for, who you love, how you're going to dress, what you're going to eat that day, the manifestations of pre-existing symptoms of mental disorders, and so on.
There's one more that I would like you to talk about that really impacted me, was the judicial response.
Yes.
And how that experiment with the judges, that was fascinating.
Yeah, you know what, David, thank you, because that's really what got our attention. So again, Jeff and Tom and I, we went to graduate school together. We thought Becker's ideas were great. That's why we kind of abandoned what we had been trained to do otherwise and moved quickly in that direction. But we weren't so sure that it was, quote, true. And yet the first experiment that we did had a profound effect on us, because it was conducted with a small sample municipal court judges in Tucson, Arizona. And it was the simplest of studies. We had about 40 judges in the municipal court in Tucson at the time. The most common case was for women accused of prostitution. All of the cases were done virtually, and so we created what looked like a court case for somebody accused of prostitution. And we showed it to 40 judges, but half of them had been reminded of their mortality previously. It was embedded in a bunch of personality questionnaires. And then we just asked them to set a bond for the alleged prostitute. That's the amount of money that you need to pay to stay out of jail until your trial. And our question was very simple. It's, would the bond be different if death was on the judge's mind? All right, in the control condition, the average bond was $50. And that was great, because that was the average bond for that crime in that town at that time. On the other hand, the half of the judges that were randomly assigned to think about their own mortality, they had their bond was 9 times higher. It averaged $455. And the reason why that finding is amazing is, first of all, these were not college sophomores. These were, quote, real humans who are trained as judges without bias to uniformly adjudicate the law. And when we debriefed the judges and explained to them what they were trying to do, they just said, there's no way that your little idiot questionnaire could have in any way affected my reaction to this case. And yet that same effect, that death reminders increase punitive reactions to moral transgressions, has been replicated dozens of times. Now, we also turn that around, because if thinking about death just makes you more punitive, well, all right, that's fine, but that's not as interesting as the other half of it, which is it makes you more exuberantly supportive of people who adhere to your worldview. Right? So the judges who were reminded of death, they were 9 times more punitive. But in another study, Americans reminded of death and who were then asked, how much do you think we should reward a citizen for thwarting a bank robbery? They said we should be 3 times more generous. And so the studies have shown that what's going on here is that mortality salience leads us to distance ourselves from those who are different, while gaining collective solidarity with those who share our views about reality. That's a fine question, David. Thank you.
To take it another step into another direction, you talk about the rise of charismatic leaders.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to that for us.
Yeah, let's do it. This is what got me involved, frankly, in all of this. I was particularly affected by Becker's chapter in The Denial of Death about the role of existential anxiety in the popularity of charismatic leaders. And so Becker talks about Max Weber, dead German sociologist, who said in times of historical upheaval, when existential anxieties are apt to be aroused, that we, when I say we mean all of us, are prone to embracing a certain kind of superficially larger than life individual who is often perceived as being divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. And it was Weber who coined the term charismatic leader. And basically, Becker writes about Hitler and how literally Hitler came to power when Germans were under extreme existential anxieties in the aftermath of World War I. And it was Hitler who came to power by promising to make Germany great again, a phrase that may have some familiar resonance to some of us today in a different location. But that was Becker's point, is that Hitler was elected and that his popularity was underlined by existential fears, and that they were attracted to his superficially self-confident claim that only he was in a position to fix things and restore their place as superior individuals. Well, anyway, I thought those ideas were remarkable, and we started to study them directly in the early 2000s, right after September 11th, 2001. This is when George W. Bush was president. And on September 10th, 2001, Bush had the lowest approval rating in the history of American politics. And yet 3 weeks later, after Bush said that he was going to rid the world of evil and that he believed that God had chosen him to lead the country during this perilous time, he had the highest approval rating in the history of American politics, even amongst Democrats. And our thought was that it might have been the mortality salience created by the events of that day that was responsible for Americans' enthusiasm for President George W. Bush. And so we did a bunch of very simple studies. In the first one, It was just we reminded people of death or something unpleasant. And we said, how much do you like President Bush and his policies in Iraq? And sure enough, they didn't like him or the policies in the control condition, but they liked it a lot when death was on their mind. Right? And then when it became evident that he was running against John Kerry, we repeated the experiment, but we added another condition. Some people think about death, others think about something else. Then we said, how much do you like either Bush or Kerry? And what we found is in control conditions, Americans liked Kerry more than Bush. Right? But when death was on their mind, they liked Bush more than Kerry. So we had a dozen or so studies that year showing that momentary reminders of death have a rather profound effect on our political preferences. That was replicated 16 or 20 years later when Donald Trump came down the escalator saying, I can make America great again, only I can fix it. And in a time of great fear and apprehension, we thought the same thing would be true. And it was. Americans preferred Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump in a benign state of mind. But if we reminded them of death first, their affection for Trump increased dramatically. And I can go on, but we have kept doing research, and there is other research that has corroborated this pattern. But let it suffice to say that ironically, we're now in kind of a demonic spiral of death, because we're in a world that we're surrounded by intimations of mortality, the instability because of the climate and the economy and politics and so on. And people are like dying everywhere. And yet in the United States, eerily, in the parts of America where more people are dying, they have higher regard for right-wing politicians, including now President Trump. So we're in an eerie moment right now where we're getting sucked into the vortex of fascism as a result of our clinging to charismatic leaders as if they're like life rafts in an ocean of upheaval. I hope that makes sense, Red.
Yeah, it really does. It's that sense that so much of what happens in real life can be viewed through this lens. And maybe today, in our present political states, it's more obvious than ever.
Yeah, and I think that's true. But what I would say, and I say this to my students and to folks that may be listening here, I have a hard time not seeing the connection between these ideas and almost everything that now goes on around us. But let's not get blinded by our own theoretical lens. Our point to students and colleagues and just interested people in general is we're not saying that fear of death causes everything that people do. What we're saying instead is that if you want to understand what people do, you're not going to get anywhere without considering the role that existential anxieties play amongst other complex and interrelated factors. I think that's an important point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
One of the things I had in my head, and maybe this is the place to ask it, is from your perspective and having done this for so long, do you see any vulnerabilities in the theory, in the thinking?
Yes. Again, great point. Let me back up a bit. My first day in graduate school at the University of Kansas in 1975, I go into this room, and on one blackboard is a quote by a famous social psychologist, Kurt Lewin, and it says, "There's nothing better or more practical than a good theory." And then on the other blackboard was, I don't remember the guy's name, a dead German physicist who said, all theories are wrong. and I'm like, wow, graduate school's hard. But the point that a lot of folks make is it's one of these theories are critical. They're basically what guide and direct our attention to certain questions. Couldn't do without them. But as I said earlier, Red, and I like your point, which is let's not get too wedded to them. Theory should not decompose into dogma.
Right.
And Jack Brum, our advisor, when we would go and say, oh, we got an idea, let us tell you why it's great, he'd be like, hey, shut up. No, think about how you might be wrong. Nietzsche said the same thing. It's like, oh, we always think it's courageous when people defend their ideas. I'll tell you what real courage is. It's the capacity to accept the possibility that you're wrong. Right. So we were. I'm not saying that we're always able to do this as respiring human beings with the same tendency as those around us, but we were not so much as scientists dedicated to proving that we were right as much to clarifying whether or not it made sense to keep going in this direction. And what I would argue is that we're not yet wrong. There's been a ton of criticisms that have been lodged against terror management theory, and they're all written, and anybody that wants to see them can find it or write to me. And they're by very smart people who are and by the way, that's called science.
Yeah.
You're not a scientist until the moment that somebody takes your work seriously enough to criticize it in the best sense of the word. It's not about how many people agree with you. That's politics or popular culture. And so we were kind of trained to look out for that. All right, but back to your original question, Red, I think that there's a couple of things that are highly problematic. And so the first of them is that our work is based on Becker's ideas. And Becker argued that a primary function of cultural worldviews is to minimize death anxiety. And so what we defined cultural worldviews as death-denying belief systems. And I do believe that that idea has merit, right? But at the same time, cultural psychologists who study cultural evolution point out that cultural worldviews are much more than just death-denying delusions or illusions. A guy named Joseph Henrich, he was at UBC, British Columbia, but now he's the chair of the anthropology department at Harvard, I think. And his argument is that cultural worldviews are the accumulated wisdom of dozens of generations. It's not merely a way to obfuscate the reality of the human condition. It is also a way to condense everything that we have learned over multiple generations and pass it over time without which the average human would be dead by lunch. His point is that we're not here today because we're any smarter than crows or dolphins. In fact, with all due disrespect to my students, I'll take the crow or the dolphin. We're here rather because of our unique capacity to collaborate in order to accumulate information that we can then transport over generations. Mm-hmm. What people have noticed, and I believe them to be right, is that we need to reconcile terror management theory with this broader notion of culture containing a mass of concentrated detail, both cognitive and affective. That's the primary foundation upon which our survival depends. Similarly, Red, our original conception of terror management theory developmentally was based on John Bowlby's attachment theory. And while we still think that to be very important, there have since in the last 50 years been developmental additions and modifications of that perspective. And so I think that it is important to juxtapose terror management theory with current evolutionary conceptions of culture, as well as developmental conceptions, in order to just get a better sense of describing these processes that might in turn lend itself to future research. And so that's one domain in which I think we were misguided. Right? Another one where I think we are led astray is too much of an emphasis on the virtues of self-esteem. Becker's original argument was that that's what we need. You need self-esteem, the belief that you're a person of value in a world of meaning. And yet I'm kind of down on, well, two things. One is I think there's other ways to manage existential anxieties besides self-esteem. And two is I'm not a big fan of self-esteem in cultures that are, like ours, just narcissistically sociopathological. In other words, in the usual culture, you get self-esteem by adhering to the values that pervade the world at any given time. And yet we live in a world, I can't remember the guy's name, but it's a book called The Tyranny of Merit by a philosopher at Harvard. It doesn't really matter, but and his point is that self-esteem is almost impossible to come by in the world in which we reside, because in order to feel good about yourself, you have to be the absolute best at whatever it is that you're doing. You know, if you're the second richest person in the world, you're a loser. If you're the second fastest in the Olympics, you're a loser, and so on and so forth. And so what some folks have argued, in fact, Becker argued this decades ago, is that that's highly problematic. When we see a whole lot of people that are having a hard time feeling good about themselves, we should look at the standards that we're taught to aspire towards to see if they're realistically attainable. And the point is that, no, that's just not the case. In a world where you need to be rich if you're a guy, and if you're a woman, you need to be young and thinner than linguine, most of us are destined to psychological despair. And so other researchers have pointed out, and this comes mainly from positive psychology and some other disciplines, but they're like, self-esteem is one way. In positive psychology these days, they talk about the triple crown of psychological well-being, and it's awe, humility, and gratitude. And sure enough, studies now show that when you're in a state of awe, just this idea that there's something about life that is way beyond our capacity to ever fathom, but like that's a good thing. Well, that turns out that when you're in a state of awe, that also makes us humble, not in a self-deprecating way, but rather in a sense that we realize that we're microscopic specks of carbon-based dust in an unfathomably large universe that is generally impervious to our existence. And yet, no matter, because we know that no matter how small or transient we are cosmically connected to all that is. Right? And that's not any hippie drivel. Otto Rank points out that that's a biological fact. We are all directly descended from the first living thing. And that makes us directly related, even indirectly, to everything that's ever been alive, everything that's now alive, everything that will ever be alive. And this idea that we're cosmically connected to all that is may have more existential power than just thinking that you're better than the person standing next to you. And then finally, when we're in a state of humility, next up is gratitude. Anybody that slept in a bed last night or had a meal today should be profoundly grateful. And sure enough, what studies have shown is that awe, humility, and gratitude all minimize or eradicate the unpleasant defensive reactions to death reminders that we find in our studies. And so people that are in awe, humility, or gratitude, they don't want to kill somebody because they're different. They don't need to eat more cookies because death is on their mind. And I think so that's another area, Red, where I think terror management theory could stand fortification, more specifically to just acknowledge that there are other ways to acquire existential equanimity. And then back to the conversation with Harvey Chachanoff about dignity therapy, because he talks about the power of storytelling and just how important it is to the average individual to be in a situation where somebody is interested. You know, you meet somebody and you're like, hey, what's your story? When you hear that and you realize that they're actually interested, and it could be that just narrative coherence in a community setting with like-minded people who are respectful of life, and because of that, acceptant of death, I think that's another direction that terror management theory would profit from going in. And then finally, this is not so much a deficit in the theory, but, you know, for the better part of 40 years, people would always, they'd find us or we'd be talking and they'd be like, well, you know, what should we do about all of this? And we're like, I don't know, just like Ernest Becker, who at the end of The Denial of Death is like, basically, just have a life, burn yourself up. And he meant it in the best sense of the word, but that wasn't all too instructive to me, either in the 1980s or now. Incinerating myself in pursuit of a good life is metaphorically attractive, but I think that there's a lot more now that can and should be done to extend these ideas beyond the management of existential anxieties to the use of these ideas to foster what Linda Emanuel and we have been calling existential maturation. Just the idea that we're all gonna die, but it doesn't mean that we all have the same approach towards recognizing and reacting to that reality. And I'm still smitten by Eric Erickson's point at the end of the 8 stages of man, although I wish he included the rest of the human race, where he distinguishes, between.
Me too.
Me too. I was like, come on, dude. Yeah. But it's still powerful when he's got, you're at the end of life and you're in this psychological fork in the road, between despair and ego integrity. You know, the despair we already know about. People, they're like, they don't like that they're getting old. They're incredibly angry and fearful about death. And if they had a choice to live their life again, they would want to do it as a different person. But other folks feel the opposite. As they get older, life appears more meaningful. As they get older, if you ask them if you could live again, who would you want to be? And they're like, I'd want to be me.
Yeah.
It's not that I didn't make mistakes, but if I get another round on the merry-go-round of life, I want to be on that horse as myself. And then, you know, when you ask them about death, they're like, well, sure, I'm apprehensive about dying. And yet that seems to be a perfectly reasonable price to pay for the ultimate joy and privilege of having been alive in the first place. And so I love the last sentence of the book where, I don't know if I'm going to get it right quote-wise, but Erickson says, when parents have the courage to die, their children will have the faith to live. And I think that that's just a nice way of summing things up. And so for us these days, at kind of the end of our academic lives, we've become more and more interested in seeing these ideas being used to study folks in more clinical settings and to hope that they contribute to the development of therapeutic interventions that can be empirically verified to be effective and might be scalable to be administered to lots of folks in a world that's in a rather large degree of distress at a time that has overwhelmed the capacity of our mental health community to be of service.
Sheldon, based on some of the information you sent us, it seemed that you were also doing some work and research around the role of palliative medicine and how that can really benefit when it's involved earlier on in the diagnosis process, around when people are turning towards making space for their existential distress and they're supported in that exploration, as palliative medicine does often a good job of doing, that they do better. Am I getting that correctly?
You are getting it. This is not my work. These are some geniuses at Harvard and Mass General. And yeah, they have done studies showing, and this really is counterintuitive, that people are sometimes reluctant, our doctors too, to put people in palliative care because they associate that with, we can't do anything else and you're going to die sooner.
Right. And we don't want to give the numbers, and we don't want to say how long we think you have to live. And people say, I don't want to hear that because that'll just put me in the wrong mindset.
Absolutely. And yet, this is where I like science. What they have found is that people that go into palliative care earlier in settings where that in no way undermines the medical care that they're receiving, that it has a number of discernible effects. It reduces anxiety and depression. It increases the possibility that people will keep track of and complete the paperwork about whether or not they want to be treated if something bad happens so that they're passed out and so. And they end up living longer, and the medical expenses are radically diminished. So whether you're interested in this from an economic point of view or from a psychodynamic one, palliative care is at the cutting edge in terms of medicine. And my point these days is when you look at what the palliative care treatments consist of, they are the most demonstrably effective ones, are focused on enhancing a sense of meaning and human value, or as Harvey calls it, dignity. And even if it sounds corny, I'm like, in a perfect universe, we should all be receiving palliative care. If in addition to being taken care of physically, we are embedded in an environment where our needs to feel meaningful and significant are attended to. I think this would have immediate effects on everyone in general, and that in turn might contribute to progressive social changes.
I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm thinking, okay, in Canada, we have another legal way of dying, and that's the medical assistance in dying.
Yes.
And I'm just sitting here trying to think of, how does the whole management theory, the idea of death, and where does that piece play into that whole thing, which could be a whole other discussion.
Yeah, move to defer. Except, to be silly, if I could answer that question, I'd be chugging rum out of a coconut with my Nobel Prize on the beach. And to understand suicide, is one of the most difficult challenges. I was at a conference with Harvey Chachnov in Japan, and that was one of the most moving discussions was about this very issue. It is a situation where it is legally permissible to terminate one's life. Is that a manifestation of terror management, or is it the ultimate manifestation of post-traumatic growth, let's say? Or is it both? And if it is, how do we differentiate? I can't think of something more interesting and important. Yeah.
I've got two little bits, but I'm not sure. I hope we have time. When you talk about existential maturity, you mentioned that earlier. What do you mean when you say that, existential maturity?
Yeah, good question, Red. And I'll give you the fortune cookie cone-like nugget, because in fairness, we would need to unpack that a bit.
Yep.
And the way that we generally think about it is existential maturity is the other side of the psychological coin from terror management. And so basically, we see it as a developmental process where people either consciously and or unconsciously, our sense is it's both, are able to be in a sustained engagement, not a morbid preoccupation, but a sustained engagement with their mortality, like the monks that used to work with the skulls on their desks. And in existential maturity language, we are subsequently able to metabolize death anxiety to the point where we can be aware of our mortality without instigating the host of defensive processes that are typically thereby enabled.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, and I know Everett said this several times in this podcast, but like that's what the 5 remembrances does.
Absolutely.
From Buddhists.
That's correct.
Right.
So, and that's why we really do, Julie. I would love to get together because I'm also moving in the Buddhist direction. And have you ever heard of this guy, James Rowe? I think he's Canadian. All right, he wrote a book called Radical Mindfulness, and you might want to find him, and you should want to find him and talk to him, because he's taken our ideas and mingled them with Buddhist feminism, indigenous thinking, and I think it's profoundly interesting and potentially fruitful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking about, like, in the year-long course I did called A Year to Live, based on Peter Levine's book, one of the pieces of our homework was for a year, every day, just to recite the 5 remembrances, right?
Absolutely.
And to me, that feels like that aligns so well with your existential maturity, because it's just not in a, as you say, preoccupation. It's just turning towards it and saying, right, I am of the nature to die.
That's right.
There is no way to escape death. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what, in this work over the years with people, and you're with them, and when they can come to that point, when they are dying, but they come to that point of, I'm not a big fan of acceptance, but that embracing of their own mortality, they're very much at peace.
That's right.
But the challenge then is that the family around them often aren't.
Yeah.
And so they often can't express that peace in a way that gets embraced by others. They all see it in terms of giving up, and Red has a great talk about that. But so it's very difficult to live in that sometimes and be supported in that. But I've watched people who are there and they love it and they're peaceful, but their world shrinks because others aren't able to embrace that with them.
David, I'm just thinking how John Beamish said in a previous episode, and those people end up often feeling very lonely at the end of their life because they have accepted or, made room for their death, but their family sometimes hasn't. Yeah.
I've come to try to take acceptance out of my vocabulary, and instead I say they've given over to reality.
Nice.
They haven't given in. They haven't given up. They've just given over. They've given over to the reality of their situation. And I mean, we often talk with folks, and it isn't necessarily dying or being dead that is causing them distress. It's the process from getting where they are at this point in time to that point, right? And I think that's the process where we learn to sort of give over. If we do, some people leave still kicking and screaming, but that sense because I struggle with acceptance as well.
Yeah.
And if we had just 2 more seconds, sorry, Julie, I know we've got the time clock on, but in your article, Fostering Existential Maturity, you speak about the role of presence.
Yeah.
And I think when we're with family members of someone who's dying, we often have conversations around what it means to be present. And I just don't know if you have anything that you'd like to sort of contribute to what it means to be present with someone who's dying.
No, honestly, Red, that I find that notion, I got that from Rollo May's The Cry for Myth.
Right.
And I would, because to be present is a multi-dimensional, complex concept. It's to be silly. It's like, well, you either get it or not. You could be in a room with somebody and you can be extraordinarily articulate and explaining why you're in distress, and the other person might be shaking their head going, I got it. Whereas you're like, you have no fucking idea what's going on. On the other hand, you can be distressed and gibbering incoherently, and somebody might be sitting there, and yet you're absolutely confident that they're engaged and comprehending. Similarly, somebody might not be saying or doing anything, but their mere physical presence is somehow uplifting and engaging. That's one of the things that the research team studying Harvey's dignity therapy found, is that for some patients, they were uplifted before the process even started. Just having a therapist come into the room and appear to be attentive and engaged. So maybe that would be one definition of presence, a sense on the part of the person being assisted that they are acknowledged and appreciated. But there's much more to it. I'd have to, and of course I'm just spewing because I'd have to go back and remember what else Rollo had to say. But I do think it's an important construct, especially in the world in which we now reside, where the average individual can be surrounded by people and yet still be isolated, insulated, and perfused with anxiety by virtue of a sense that they're in an empty space, even if it's Tokyo and there's 6 million other people around them.
Right.
Wow. So today has left me with lots to process for sure, and so grateful.
Yeah,
but
me too.
one of the pieces it's left me with, man, I wish I was 30, 40 years younger and sitting in your class.
Yeah, me too.
I'd love to be a student again, but I'd like to know what I know now.
Yeah, there you go.
And sit in your, and just be a student again. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing it with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.